So let's talk about some of the ways that the theory of evolution is supported. Now this is going to be some sort of concepts and themes, some specific examples, but this theory is been supported in a variety of different ways. The first is by direct observation. So this is actually looking at an organism or a group of organisms and seeing how they change in response to some sort of environmental pressure. So I have two different examples here. The Galapagos finches are a good example. I sort of touched on that a little bit. There are all kinds of examples of direct observation of natural selection. So our book goes into two that I think are quite interesting. One are these soapberry bugs. So these are these sort of beetle type bugs that live in Florida, and their population showed evolution in response to an introduced species of food. So these soapberry bugs have needle-like hollow, long, thin, hollow mouth parts. So they would stick their beak-like mouth part down into the fruits that they eat. So they feed on the seeds of this plant called the balloon vine. You can see exactly why they call that the balloon vine. So this is a large round fruit, and way deep inside in the center of that are seeds that the soapberry bugs are trying to get to. So the balloon vine started to decline when this golden rain tree was introduced into the area. So this is a different plant. You can see it actually is sort of a similar type shape, except that they are long and, or sort of similar structure, except that they're longer and thinner. So this golden rain tree became a new food source for these soapberry bugs. You can see that the shape is longer and thinner. The fruit is flatter and the seeds aren't as deep. So what happened was that in response to the change in food source, the size of the mouth parts on these soapberry bugs actually changed. So this is two different graphs that show the individual beak length and the number of individuals feeding on the golden rain tree fruit. So this is a historical average beak size, or keep saying beak, mouth part size, oh they say beak too, beak length, of these species. So based on museum estimates, museum species and living species, the soapberry bugs that are feeding on the balloon vine have longer mouth parts than those that are feeding on the golden rain tree. So they were actually comparing two different populations, a population in southern Florida where the balloon vine was still more prevalent, and then a population in central Florida where that golden rain tree had been introduced. And so they found that those that were now feeding on this golden rain tree, so they've had a change in their environment, and the population has responded to this by decreasing their beak size. So you can see the average size. The balloon vine species are much larger. The golden rain tree are much smaller. So this is showing that even just in a kind of a short amount of time, a population can change in response to their environment. In this case, it was a food source. So another one is MRSA. So this is a problem, can be a problem in hospitals and healthcare facilities. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So this is a sort of a bacteria that is resistant to a whole host of antibiotics. And it's really important because if you have a bacteria in a medical setting that is resistant to all the antibiotics, you're going to have infections that you can't treat. This is sort of an example of evolution of drug resistance, which is really important. people or organisms and bacteria and even viruses as well are in a constant arms race between being able to infect their host and the host being able to fight it off. The medical community is kind of in a constant arms race against bacteria and viruses that change, so their medications and treatments, antibiotics and things no longer work on them. So the bacteria we're looking at is Staphylococcus aureus. This is a common bacteria found in nasal passages. And bacteria can transfer genes, transfer pieces of their DNA to one another through something called horizontal gene transfer, and the actual process is called conjugation. So they can spread their antibiotic resistance very quickly because bacteria have really short generation times. And so that means that they divide very quickly, and so you get really high numbers. And if they're sharing genes, if one of them acquires a mutation that allows them to survive, they're going to pass that gene on both to their offspring and to possibly other bacteria in the area. This MRSA bacteria is really kind of deadly. It can cause these massive infections in individuals. So penicillin was developed in 1949. Bacteria quickly became resistant to that, and so methicillin was developed. And so this is what eventually led to this methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. And since then, this Staph aureus has acquired other antibiotic resistances. Oops, excuse me, I got a little click happy there. So here we have another example of evolution actually working that we can see happening. So besides directly observing it, there are some concepts that help us see the process of evolution. So remember we talked about descent with modification. Those are characteristics that were in ancestral organisms that have been altered over time through natural selection because the descendants have faced new environmental conditions. So this means related species might have similar characteristics that perform different functions in their current situation, or they have acquired similar but different characteristics to deal with the same problem. So homology is this idea of having a similar structure due to a common ancestor. So basically, a structure has acquired a new function over time. So homology leads to homologous structures. So homology is the process, the homologous structure is what you're actually considering. So let's take this example of the human forearm. We can see the homologous structures in a variety of different mammals. So the basic structure would have been present or is present in a common ancestor. And you can see that they have highlighted the different bone structures and their positions in these different animals. So the similar structures, but possibly different functions. So if you look at the human arm, the human hand, and the cat forelimb, you can see they're actually really, really similar. Similar proportions to those bones, similar arrangement and structure, similar joint structure and things like that. Really it's because they're a different function. Obviously a cat is walking on all fours, so there has to be some difference there, and we're not walking on our hands, at least most of us are not, and we're grabbing, so we have, and holding on to things. So we do have a slightly different function, but we have a very similar structure, and that's because of a similar ancestor with that similar bone structure. But then we have the whale and the bat, and you can see that these are very different. We still have these sort of homologous bones present and a similar type arrangement, but they've taken on a different shape. And that's because this variation in structure is due to the environments in which these animals live. So the whale is using its flipper not for walking, but for swimming. And so the fingers actually take up or what would be the fingers take up most of the structure of that whale flipper. Whereas the bat is using its wings to fly. And so this is another very different structure. It's a mammal, so we have similar structure. You can see that structure is even more similar to the cat and the human than the whale is to either the cat or the human. But again, we have those really elongated fingers, and that is to provide the structure for the wing of the bat. So we have these similar structures due to similar ancestry, but they're being used for different functions. And so they have changed to fit the function of the environment these organisms are in. So we can see them in the homologous structures in the fully developed organism, but we can also see homologous structures in development. So organisms that are more closely related tend to develop via the same pattern and show structural similarities throughout their development. So here we have a chick embryo and a human embryo. And you can see that they actually look quite similar. They have some structures that are present. These pharyngeal arches are important in the development of both of these organisms, but they're not present in the full-grown adult. The tail, humans don't have tails anymore, but there is still this stage in development where both the human and the chick have this tail. A chick doesn't really have a tail either. There are tail feathers, but those are growing off of the tail. So these are what we call vestigial structures. These are structures that were present in the ancestors, but don't have a function in living organisms. So humans don't develop the tail. It's still part of our fetal development, but it's not there in the living organism. We don't use our tails anymore. We don't have them anymore. So human tail bones are an example. The structure is still there. Actually, I'm sorry. I'm sort of combining two different ideas. We see the development of this homologous structure of the tail, but not in the full-grown adult. Separate from that are vestigial structures. These are structures that have been lost from the ancestors. The ancestors would have had these structures, but we don't have them anymore. But there are still some structures that are left that haven't been completely lost. So we don't have tails. Humans don't have tails anymore, but we do have tail bones. So these are the bones that would have connected the tail to the base of the base of the back. Snakes still have a pelvis and hip bones, but they don't have any legs. So there really hasn't been any reason to lose the pelvis and the hip bones, so they still have them, even though they're not actually using them for legs. All right, so homology is similar structures used for different functions, but we have sort of the opposite situation here with the idea of convergent evolution and analogy. So sometimes organisms that are not closely related have similar structures. And this is the idea of convergent evolution. So what's happening here is that organisms who are facing similar environmental challenges, who are not closely related, acquire similar adaptations. So similar environment leads to similar adaptation, but they're not adaptations that come from a common ancestor. So the example here is a sugar glider, which is a marsupial, and the flying squirrel, which is a rodent in the United States. So both of these are small animals that have a flap of skin between their forelimbs and their hind limbs, and they can use that to glide. So they both live in environments with really tall trees, and they will jump from their trees, spread out their arms, and then glide on this flap of skin. But their more closely related common ancestors don't have this. So an analogous structure is when two organisms adapt to similar environments in the same way. Analogous structures then are structures or features that are similar due to convergent evolution, not due to a similar ancestor. A similar function has produced a similar shape, but no common ancestry is there. This picture on the right actually shows homology and analogy. The pterodactyl in the bird actually are quite closely related. It is thought that birds and dinosaurs had a common ancestor. So in those wing structures of this pterodactyl and the bird, we actually have homology, similar structure due to a common ancestor. But then we throw in the bat and we see analogy. So the bat wing has a similar shape, a similar structure for the same function, but it comes from a different structure. So we have the bird wing is a different structure than the bat wing. The bird and the bat are not closely related. They don't derive that wing from the same common ancestor. A bat has, the bat species has acquired that wing structure, even though none of its more closer common ancestors have it. So bats are mammals and their most common relatives don't have the wing, whereas, and so the bat structure did not come from the bird structure. Analogy can explain processes as well as structures. So if you remember from photosynthesis, we talked about the process of C4 photosynthesis. This was one of our adaptations for really hot, dry environments. That process has developed independently, so analogous evolution over 40 times or up to 40 times in the plant world. So even though these plants are not sharing a close common ancestor and they're not deriving C4 photosynthesis from a common ancestor, this process has a very similar process has come up excuse me, several times in the evolution of these plants. So just like Charles Darwin, we can use the fossil record to see patterns of evolution. So Darwin saw this, we can see this today at museums, that present organisms differ from past organisms. This suggests a change over time. It suggests that at some point some organisms die out because they are no longer adapted to their environment, and adaptations in their populations don't happen quickly enough for them to keep up. But we can also see evolutionary changes in organisms over time. So this is the ankle bone of a variety of different organisms. So most mammals have this shape on the left where we have two ridges and a dip in the center, and then sort of one ridge along the bottom. So this is going to be where your sort of your foot connects to your leg bone. Based on the structure of this bone, it was proposed that cetaceans, which are your whales and dolphins, are actually most closely related to ungulates, even-toed ungulates. So these are going to be deer and pigs and things like that. Cetaceans look quite different from other mammals, and so it was hard to determine where they were related. Where did they actually come from? Well, using the fossil record to look at the ankle bone of Pakicetus, which is an ancestral cetacean, a pig, and a deer, they were able to see this similar structure, this homologous structure that suggested that the most closely related ancestors to cetaceans were actually the ancestors of the ungulate. So here is a phylogenetic tree, which is just a diagram showing the relationship between organisms. Up here we've got the deer, we've got the hippopotamus. These are even-toed ungulates. So they have this bone structure here. And then this is Pakicetus. This is an extinct organism that is the organism that they're using for comparison. So they are looking at the bone structure of the ankle. They're also looking at the pelvis and the hind leg bone structure. And when they do that, they can see a pattern that that they can use to determine the evolution of these organisms and suggest that these living cetaceans, the whales and dolphins, are actually most closely related to current deer and hippo. So our last bit of evidence that helps us support evolution is biogeography. So biogeography is just the study of how species are distributed across the earth. So this allows us to see where organisms would have come from, where they originated and where they spread out from. They can spread because they have moved. They can spread because the continents have moved. So you sometimes see similar organisms on two different continents because their ancestors were connected. When the continents were connected before they all moved, there were ancestral organisms that were there that sent their characteristics down the line to each of the species, even though they're on different continents now. We can also look at endemic species. These are species that are found nowhere else. Australia is a great example of endemic species. Often you find endemic species on islands that are closely related to other species. And you can see similar characteristics. You can see where their ancestral populations were. And you can see where they came from, but now they have a different distribution. So you can look at how organisms are distributed, how they have moved over time, and that can help you see how evolution is changing them to fit their environment as they move, as their distribution changes.